genuine person in real life. So
Very cool.
go with her.
Cool. Thank you. Let me see. Can I, Alex B, welcome. Would you mind sharing your favorite musician or band, or a favorite musician or band?
Yeah, hi. Super hard question. I'm learning a new piece on the guitar by Johann Sebastian Bach, so I'm picking him for tonight.
Very cool. I'm gonna just kind of go around randomly. How about Ellen Judd? Do you have a favorite musician or band you'd like to share with us?
Bruce Coburn.
Bruce Colburn. Cool,
Yep.
Thank you. How about William Young?
You got me unawares. Oh my goodness.
You gotta get me on your toes for this.
Need preparation for this kind of question. I mean, so many.
One,
I would say
a favorite, not the favorite.
I would say Neil Young.
Neil Young.
I started with him and I'm never going to leave him.
Very good. How about Steve Batchelor? What's your a favorite musician or band?
Dylan.
Dylan. Very good. Very cool. How about Anka? Do you have a favorite musician or band?
Not really. But someone mentioned Moondog here the other, I don't know when, like a few weeks ago, and I didn't know about him. So I looked him up and I really like his stuff. It sounds very dreamy, kind of, I like it.
Very cool. How about, excuse me, but for the pronunciation of this, Anshul?
Yeah, that's right. It's Anshul. That's perfect. I think I don't know. I think I'll go with Nina Simone, and like just Christmas and the music. It just brings alive. Yeah.
Very good. How about Dana Damon?
Hi, I just joined. Could you repeat the question?
Do you have we're just doing an icebreaker. Do you have a favorite musician or band you'd like to share?
Let me think about it. Maybe Yanka Dagilova. She's a Russian punk musician from the 80s.
That sounds cool. Never heard of her. I
can look her up.
How about Monica Hardy? Do you have a favorite musician or band you could like to share? Yeah. No. How about Mark Fuller? Do you have a favorite musician or band?
Just a second. Am I on? Wait.
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, that's a difficult question. There are a lot of wonderful musicians. Thelonious Monk.
Ooh, very good. Cool. How about Nika? Do you have a favorite musician or band?
I also will be Russian for today, so I would choose Vladimir Vysotsky, or even Dina Verny. Dina Verny was a lover of Mayol. She was singing Russian prison songs.
Oh,
we should actually put it all, some of them in chat, So
yeah, feel free to. I mean, these are great. Many of these I don't know, so feel free to put your musician in chat so that we can. I'll check them out if you want to. Let's do a couple more before we start the conversation. Have I gone with Amy Heller?
Well, I'm Dylan all the way also, but I'll put in a plug for the Mountain Goats.
Mountain Goats.
A band my son loves, and I agree.
Cool. How about Claire? You have a favorite musician?
People talking about punk.
However.
Polystyrene.
Polystyrene. Okay. Very cool. How about Gabby?
Hi. Okay, sorry world, but Led Zeppelin. And I actually have ready answer to that question, which is like Led Zeppelin and Vitor Hara and Chico Science and Gogo Bordello.
Very cool. Yeah, we can all make long lists, I'm sure. How about Alexander Valesky? Excuse me.
Hi. Yeah, Alexander Volchyshin. And since I'm from Ukraine, my take is Oleg Skripka.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's go for like 2 more, and then we'll join. And if I've missed anyone, I'm sorry, but we can also just add them all in the chat so that if there's anyone we don't know, we can check them out. Let's go with, have I asked Rob? Rob L.
Yeah, no, so many. I love dancing, so I'm going to go with a band called the James Taylor Quartet, and they're often mixed up with James Taylor, obviously, but the James Taylor Quartet, they're a jazz funk band, and they're absolutely amazing. And then from when I was a lot younger, I used to like John McLaughlin and the Mahavishnu Orchestra.
Oh, classic. Yeah, great. Okay, cool. And the last one, I'll give it to John Fass.
That's so kind of you to give me the last one. When I'm choosing a conjunction, which is a bit cheeky, I know, but I'm choosing a conjunction between Negativland for their flagrant disregard for copyright laws and their donation of their entire catalogue to Creative Commons and their punishing lawsuit with U2. And I'm clashing that with lyrical songster Damien Girardo for emotional intensity.
Great. We have a great list. Yeah, thank you, everyone. I'm not sure, who am I passing it off to? Who's leading this next discussion?
Oh, I'm facilitating. Yeah.
Great. Welcome. So our next guest, if you read, I don't know if she's in this specific section, but if you've read the entire book, she needs no introduction. I think she was actually, you were involved in with David Graeber in the initial Occupy movement, and she's going to lead a discussion on the book from the first 20 or so pages of the 4th chapter of the Democracy Project. So without further ado, we have Marisa Holmes, and I think just another reminder, I believe this is being recorded. So just a heads up if you want to take off your camera, change your name to make it more anonymous, now is the time. Thank you very much. Go ahead, Marisa.
Hi, thanks for reading this book and having me join you. I've been following a bit from a distance the reading group happenings, and it seems like a really good energy that you have going, and I wanted to be involved more. So I kind of, I come in and out of being involved in things. I'm still organizing and doing a lot in New York, so I do what I can. But I'm excited to be here today. And yeah, I was one of the early occupiers, day 1 occupiers, even before that at Zuccotti Park, and collaborated with David on facilitation and the process working group, and then developed trainings on facilitation for people who were coming in. I mean, there's a lot that I could say, but David was a dear friend and comrade, and someone who really did contribute a lot to the formation of Occupy. And some of that is addressed in this book. I mean, the Democracy Project is really like the Occupy book. A lot of attention was drawn to the debt book, and that was also very important work. And like I was part of Strike Debt. A lot of people in Occupy were part of building a debt movement, but the democracy part of it is often left out in official narratives. And so, yeah, the lesser known but very important history is outlined here in the Democracy Project, and it's placed within this history of radical democratic experiments in the United States from before the United States even existed as a government, as a concept. And so what David is trying to do is basically break down the myth of America as or the United States as a democracy, right? That like the founding fathers didn't even want a democracy. They wanted something that was much more top down, and that they were challenged by these uprisings that continued to happen, right? And then had to modify as a result. That like the Bill of Rights, for instance, was a result of this kind of compromise that they made to people who had been out in the streets and resisting the colonial government. So that's what's addressed earlier in the book. So there's sort of like an Occupy prehistory, and then contextualizing that within this larger radical democratic history of resistance, right? And then what we read, I think everyone read, or at least some of it, was chapter 4, which is how change happens, right? And it's the sort of practical how to, I mean, it's still laden with, various theoretical interventions, but it's written in a very accessible way. It just breaks down, how consensus works, some sort of core principles around consensus, questions that are common that come up, and I kept imagining David like fielding press requests and, all the various things that came through, and maybe preparing these question responses just to help, help in that time in that process, because it was really overwhelming. I know for myself, having to be asked the same question, 12 times, like, well, why don't you use majority vote? Surely there must be leaders, and you're hiding them somewhere. They're like a secret clique that's, off making decisions, like it's just impossible, this like leaderless horizontal experiment. Surely there must be some like, secret elite somewhere else. All these sort of like odd questions that I also got. He tries to address in this like Q&A. It's very lengthy Q&A. Yeah, and there are a few other things. Yeah, I guess it was just the first 20 pages, but basically there's a question of violence that comes up, the paradox of sovereignty, that the sovereign only exists after this violent insurrection takes place, and then it continues to assert its legitimacy, based on the monopoly of violence and quelling of like future insurrections. So just, the sort of absurdity of that. And he talks about Occupy really as like a dual power strategy, and tries to distinguish, tactics from strategy, that like really, often debates around tactics or debates around strategy. So we were using this dual power strategy, and essentially relying on this Argentinian model of delegitimizing the political elites, politicians, and trying to form our own sort of parallel institutions. So yeah, that's the broad strokes of the sort of the arc of the thing. But I guess there are a few questions, there are questions around let's see, I wrote up some questions. Well, around principles. So, at some point, whoever is gathered together in an assembly or a spokes council or, just a gathering, has to come up with some kind of principles. He keeps asserting this, right? But then there's really a question of like, well, how do you maintain those principles if there's no mechanism of coercion in the organization? And so basically what he's arguing here is that the only way is through like training and practices, and things become so sort of embedded in the culture of the group that it's just impossible to to do anything else. And then if you have disruptors or people coming in with bad intentions or whatever, for whatever reason, like social isolation, getting them out of the group, just ignoring them, that's sort of the main strategy that that he advocates for. But then there's ultimately this question of like, well, what if that doesn't work? And how do you defend these spaces? How do you defend these autonomous parallel spaces that you created? So I guess I'll just leave it that. And you know, we can talk about some of the strategies that David outlines, or just talk about our own experiences. But yeah, I mean, for me, Occupy was like an incredibly transformative, imaginative space of possibility. And it, you know, changed my life and the lives of a lot of people I care a lot about. But yeah, but there are questions that continue to come up, and yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure how much longer to go. I'm not very good at formal presentations. You know, I would much prefer to just have a discussion and see, you know, what we all think. So as far as these reading group sessions, I mean, do you usually have like kind of agreements or ways that you take stack, or how do they, what's the process of these meetings, I guess is my question.
I think Vasily maybe wants to describe. But we didn't have so many, Marisa, so we steal information. It's different reading groups are going different ways.
Yeah, so hello, Marisa. We usually start with a summary of the text, and just to start off a conversation. So now, you know, if someone wants to start the conversation, try to answer some of Marisa's questions, then you know, go for it. And you can, yeah, you can just start talking basically. Rob, you want to say something? I see that your hand is raised, so you can go ahead.
Cheers, thank you. Marisa, you said that you were in on the Occupy thing and you were in there from day one. I wonder what your experiences were with from the very beginning, because I imagine that it was something which happened fairly sort of suddenly, and it must have been moving very quickly. Did it manage to sort of bring everybody along with it, or were there groups who were the main dynamic behind what was going on? It's the speed of it which gets me actually on this one here. I wonder what your feelings were at the time.
Yeah, well, you know, David describes pretty well in the beginning of the book, which obviously was not like required reading, I guess, for this. But if anyone did read it, then you'd have a little bit of a sense of it, a sense of what went on. Basically, there was this context, right, of the 2008 economic crisis. There were a lot of groups doing things around, you know, bailing out the banks, and you know, protesting against the bailout of the banks, and that, you know, arguing that we should bail out the people, or, you know, various actions were already happening along these lines. There was, in the spring of 2011, a lot of housing organizing. There was Organizing for Occupation, O4O, that came out of Students for a Democratic Society, the new version, part 2.
Was that the socialist group?
No, they were kind of, well, so some of them would identify as anarchists, some of them would call themselves communists, but they were really interested in like participatory democracy and Paracon, sort of following Michael Albert in that school of thought around the Z Institute. So they had started a housing group, and they're actively like squatting buildings in Brooklyn, like where I currently live. So there's already a lot of housing activity and taking over space. And then there was also some labor movement stuff happening with the May 12th coalition. So like all the major unions in the city with the Labor Council, they came together to do this like march on Wall Street on May 12th. And basically it was opposed to the city budget cuts. All the public sector workers were going to experience, you know, austerity measures. And so they formed a coalition, but then they didn't do anything after that. They just like marched and then left and had their, you know, their speakers, the pre-programmed whatever speakers. And so it didn't really, you know, have any impact in stopping the cuts. And there was even this Bloombergville sort of soft occupation where some of the folks from that coalition were like camped out in front of the city hall building in the financial district. And they were also not successful like in stopping the cuts. So that was like through the end of June. And then in July, the Adbusters call was circulated around on different listservs and in activist groups in the city. I got it because I was on the Bloombergville list and also the US Uncut list. US Uncut was modeled after the UK Uncut group, doing these like flash mob kind of bank occupations, mostly creative, mostly nonviolent, just, like going in and sort of like throwing confetti at Bank of America, or, having David come and give a guest lecture or something like that. But yeah, people were talking about Occupy Wall Street, but in the sort of activist scene in New York at the time, like, we're pretty dismissive because, Adbusters they're not from here. They're based in Vancouver, and they didn't intend to actually like organize anything on the ground. So hardly anyone wanted to respond to it at all. They're just like, whatever, Adbusters. But some of the Bloombergville people wanted to respond. And Bloombergville, it ended up being like a kind of, left coalition. There was the Organizing for Occupation group, and then there was also, a lot of like more sectarian, authoritarian socialist groups like Workers' World and the ISO, and Workers' World tended to like really dominate the Bloombergville group, unfortunately. So even though they decided to do something on August 2nd, this assembly in front of the Bull, they advertised an assembly. It wasn't really an assembly. And so David has this like, very sort of scathing critique of how all the various groups interacted, and, how the like horizontal people who showed up, all the anarchists and punks and whatever, were like, oh, we're not going to do that, and Georgia intervened. And there's all sorts of detail, and it's very theatrical. But basically there was a split that happened from the verticals and the horizontals, and like the horizontals went and formed an assembly, and that was the New York City General Assembly, NYCGA, which I was part of, and which planned the occupation of September 17th. So that's a kind of long, complicated answer, but basically there was this context of the economic crisis, and then there was also like the New York City context of like people wanting to do things around banks, but there wasn't like a horizontal democratic kind of ethos, or like, people weren't trying to create that. They didn't know how to create that, but they were like kind of inspired by the idea of like, oh, it's happening in other places. It happened in North Africa, in the Middle East, it happened in Europe. So like, surely we can do it here. So even some of the people who like would have been really skeptical, who were more authoritarian or vertical, whatever, ended up joining eventually the more horizontal networked space, because it was just like the global zeitgeist of the moment. And it also felt better, I'm sure the experience, I'm positing, I don't know what everyone's experience was individually, but it's probably really invigorating to like be in an assembly and be able to speak and be heard. And so it just kind of drew people in over time, like even all the skeptics. So yeah.
There was one parallel between what happened in New York and what happened in London, which I always thought was interesting, and that was that in the park that you were in, that the status of the park, it was semi-private, and therefore the activists were able to meet and set up in the park. What happened in London when Occupy happened was that it happened on the in front of St Paul's Cathedral, and the reason it was able to take place there is that the Dean of St Paul's Cathedral was somewhat sympathetic to the people at the time, so the police really had to sort of stand back a bit because they were on territory. The protesters, the people involved, they were on territory, if you like, which the police couldn't actually move in on unless they were invited to do so by the cathedral. I think that's an important part of these social movements. They get attacked by the police if they go into public spaces. They have to somehow manage to find somewhere where they can be a little bit more protected, I feel.
Yeah, I have a lot to say about that, but I'm curious if anyone else wants to weigh in. David does discuss a bit, the type of space that we were in, and like the maybe you're referring to this, the sort of double strategy. So there's a strategy around the right to be there and assemble, right? which appealed to liberals. And then there's also the strategy of just like withdrawal and, you know, creating our own autonomous institutions. And so we could kind of hold both. And he, you know, he thinks that this was like a really, you know, kind of surprisingly genius move. And, you know, it's true. I don't remember like having a premeditated conversation where we were like, okay, this is how we're going to execute it, or, you know, because even the space itself, Sakati Park was like a backup location. It wasn't where we were originally supposed to gather. We wanted to, you know, be on Wall Street or maybe Chase Plaza, and then Sakati was just like available at the time, and so we ended up there kind of by chance. But it worked out because of that public-private thing, and also, yeah, like the appeal to the public. It gave us like a little bit of a shield. You know, it took a while for the city to adjust and figure out, like, you know, what the political move would be. Yeah.
So I just wanted to say quickly that we also read this text in connection to another project of the Museum of Clare, which is about you know, making decision, how to make decision. And I think this project is led by Nika and Anka. So if you want to say something about that, so maybe we could connect this reading to this project. Anka or Nika, whoever.
Yeah. Yeah, we want to find out how people take collective decisions in different contexts. So far, yeah, so we speak with different people and we interview them, and anyone can interview people about this decision-making processes. And I was actually thinking, is there anything that changes over time in terms of how decisions are made? Is that initially, is it a bit where you try to find a system that works for everyone, and then as time goes on, it's a bit smoother? Or is it just an assumption that time resolves conflicts?
Well, I mean, but what do you all think? What's your experience been? Like, have you been in these kinds of groups or conversations before? Like, you know, does time heal all wounds? Nika?
Yeah, I also want to add to what Anka said, that the idea of this project was try to put together an experiment in which we can produce something collectively that would not require any approval. So try to model a really horizontal process, because answering your question, how the decision, how I think it's work, the moment of the problem starting when you cannot do anything, when you didn't get an approval of somebody else. So, you know, so if you just can walk away and do your own things, there is no problem. The problem started when somebody is not allowing you to go to the direction where you want to go. So this collective documentary, we develop a certain license. So anybody who agree to take part in that automatically agree that all materials will be online for anybody to use. So, and we just put a hashtag so we can connect all of these interviews together through internet. And then, you know, somebody can make a video installation with that material. So can make a book or can make a documentary. So far we did like 4 interviews, and we aim to take an interviews from different people, not only you know, from activists and famous people, but also Clare Farrell found the policeman, English policeman, who will describe us how do they make decisions, you know. And we hope to work with free and democratic schools with kids, so they will describe how in their assemblies they make decisions, and with Icelandic people who put their bankers in prison, and so on and so forth. But so for me, what I learned from David and from this chapter that I just reread is the whole social system where we live in is just make us work and interact with each other in this hierarchical ways. So what we should try to do, we should just try to kind of develop a different social architect, and it's very complicated to do. But also what he write here and what he was telling me all the time, that ideally you want to work in very small groups and make decisions in a small collective, in affinity groups. But then you only bring it to the like bigger group for consensus if it has a very, very defined purpose. Like Clare Farrell was describing in her interview how Extinction Rebellion is doing and why they're horizontal, because they basically engage in a civil disobedience. And you cannot make people risk their life if they don't want to, if they didn't agree to do that, to get arrested. So it's either they agree or they walk away, that's it. So it's all kind of natural. And yeah, so that's what I gather from this text. That looks to me very clear, simple, and like almost like an instruction.
Yeah.
Yeah, predating the this decision-making project was a decision-making group, and we were sort of the internal project at Museum of Care that explored all of these decision-making procedures and mindsets. And something we realized early on, at least, you know, I was thinking about it. Michael Albert mentions 3 ways of making decisions. One is consensus, another is voting, and another is fiat. And, you know, fiat is you deciding, sort of like, you know, you being a Stalin. And his example is that if you're in an office and you have a picture on your desk, who gets to decide if you get to have a picture of your family on your desk? You do. You get to be the Stalin of that decision. But as for having, you know, playing music, maybe that's something else because that affects everyone else. And so a different kind of decision-making procedure would be more appropriate, like consensus or voting. And so we found early on, there was an issue when we had scarcity, scarcity versus abundance. If you have scarcity and you have a group, then you have to have some sort of group decision-making procedure. And if you don't have scarcity, you have abundance and everyone can do what they want. So then you get to use fiat. Everyone gets to decide what they do with the abundant resource because there is no need to necessarily coordinate, although of course you can if you want. So I believe, from my perspective at least, Museum of Care has gone away from scarcity, because we tend to trip when we have group decision-making procedures, to seeking abundance whenever possible. So we try to, when we see a scarce thing, we try to ask ourselves, okay, how can we make this not scarce? How can we reframe things so that we have abundance and therefore we get to all sort of do what we want together or separately as we wish and fluidly. So that's my take on that chapter. And that's what I think that we've developed here. I've never read it anywhere else.
Yeah, if I can add to that, TJ, is I think one of the things that really reminded me from rereading the chapter, I read it a long time ago, but it's the first time I've read it in a while, is that like you don't bring things to consensus unless you need to, right?
Right.
Like, and I think we had maybe even a tendency is like, well, what does everyone think about this? Like, when doesn't matter, like you do your thing, and unless it's like a very rare thing, there's no need to get full group approval. And kind of in that too, I liked how they even specified, and this is kind of one of the things that initiated one of that the group process, aka decisions group, was, well, how do we plan a meeting for next week? Is it okay to go to voting? And one of the things he mentions in there is like, if the facilitator says basically, does next Friday work for everyone? You know, is it okay if we just do a vote on it? That's not necessarily like you're breaking consensus. It's not a divergence from how you operate. It's just like, hey, we have a simple decision. Are we meeting Friday or not? But can most of the people come? Yes, no, okay. That's where we're at. So there's a flexibility there that you need to learn. There's a learning curve of what's appropriate when, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of emphasis on the principle of consent, rather than coercion, and the exact process is kind of open to interpretation, and depending on what works for whatever group or context, right? Like that's something that is reiterated throughout the chapter, and in other work that David wrote. Yeah, and I guess I would just say that, like, in this case of meeting times, it's really more of a poll than a vote. It's like, oh, you have distinct options, and people will either go with those options or not. And so it's just more efficient that way. But people still have a say. I mean, that's like that's the thing. You have to have an equal say. No one can be coerced into doing anything, right?
Interested. I was also in the group, and I was interested in some of the accounts of Occupy. I don't know if it's in this text because I haven't had a chance to reread it, but about using alternatives to kind of traditional narratives or traditional logics, a sort of adversarial logic kind of way of communicating, and instead using more story or using sort of shared narrative, like in small groups, to come back to the main group with a shared narrative, those sort of more diverse ways of communicating. I was wondering if there's any experience you have on that you could share.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also happy to just talk about David's work, but I can answer whatever question. There's actually another question in the chat that's been up there for a while, so I'll try to hold both. One is advice on handling obstructionism. Okay. Yeah, and then the narratives, shared stories. Yeah, I mean, it's much easier if you're starting with a smaller group and then kind of expanding out from there, rather than putting like an open call and then trying to develop consensus. Yeah, I mean, we did have in Occupy, we had like a mission statement that was drafted in the early assemblies over the summer, and that was a smaller group of like probably 40 people attending, instead of thousands of people. And those are the most committed people, because they were willing to put in the time and energy, and so there's more agreement at that point. And yeah, I guess I would just like having shared principles to start, in some sort of basic framework. You don't have to work out everything, but knowing like why you're there, what's motivating you, which David also talks about as fundamental, it's much easier to work out in a smaller group. And then like the shared narratives. I mean, yeah, I was part of the media group. We had a charter that we drafted, and we tried to create counter narratives, and make tactical media interventions, by combining alternative infrastructure with social media with like traditional press. So we had like a cluster model, media cluster, and then within that, different ways of disseminating information, and that worked pretty well in terms of getting an audience. Because if you only do like the alternative infrastructure and don't engage in any of these other ways, then it's really hard to get something out. So I don't know. I mean, but I think also just informally day to day, like through the trainings, and through the process of the assembly itself, there was a shared narrative, and like we just repeated over and over, like, we are here for these reasons. Like we're here for horizontalism, for direct democracy, because we want everyone to have a say, because the 1%, like just really basic sort of over and over, and that started to actually seep into the culture. So I don't know if that helps, but yeah. Okay.
I sort of meant something slightly different, actually. Sorry to just continue. I meant basically diversity, you know, people who speak in a different kind of way. So you have this sort of traditional academic or logic or adversarial way of communicating where you're fighting with a series of points. I'm thinking more about people who communicate through telling stories, personal accounts, or people who may be more cautious about speaking in a large, you know, it's massive, wasn't it? So they would share, like they would share with the group around them and speak together in order to enter into the discussion. Is that kind of thing more about process in the moment in the assembly? That's what I was wondering about.
Yeah, I mean, it was a collaborative space. So there wasn't this like counterpoint kind of debate. It was really, you know, we're all in this together, we're going to generate solutions together. And we would have breakout groups, you know, so people could talk more informally and then report back to the larger assembly.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, people lived in the park. That's true. It was kind of crazy, but yeah.
So I had and it's something I realized from reading the book, that it's funny that it took me, I've read it years ago, I loved the book, how long it took me to like break into my head the difference between voting and consensus. I think for me, the one way I realized I was finally able to see that difference is consensus. Voting is about finding the agreement. We all agree we want to do X, but consensus is actually almost more about understanding the disagreement. In my mind, you understand that disagreement, you try to work with it and kind of address concerns, and you spend, and then at the end of the entire consensus process, you don't say, does everyone agree? You almost say, are there any more objections or you know, blocks or anything like that? Is that a reasonable kind of summary of it?
That's an interesting summary, sure. You know, there are a plurality of opinions. That's part of consensus.
You're muted, Nika.
Oh, Nika.
Yeah, I think it's great summary, because for me, consensus is a process in which no one forced to do what they don't want to do.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the major thing. So there is no violence, basically. And but it's also required, you can only, to my understanding, you can only make consensus decisions in a situation when it's some very specific urgent needs. Again, like Extinction Rebellion, we are going to go south to the bridge, you know, or we're going to get arrested to end up in prison. So you need consensus for that. But if we are like, you know, trying to get consensus on 100 people, are we going to, you know, go all to Spain for a vacation? Or, you know, if we're going to paint this picture blue or red, that's kind of wrong mechanism, you know, to decide this type of things. So that's my take on that. So it should be some urgent pressing point to make decision, and everybody should agree that this makes sense to spend our lifetime to make these decisions.
Yeah, it was really interesting. Also, in this chapter, David brought up Madagascar again, like, you know, some of the field work that he did in Madagascar, and how they never had like permanent formal institutions, even though they would operate, you know, by consensus, like the principle of consensus. They would never have like a council that was just there, like a standing council or a standing assembly or something. Like they would come together, like, you know, when there was a specific need to make a decision about something, and how this like kind of confounded the French colonial government, and, you know, even the post-colonial government. You know, they kept trying to figure out, like, well, yeah, like who are the leaders, and where are the mechanisms of power, and how can we, you know, have representatives or whatever speak, and it didn't exist. They like kept trying to impose it, and then it, you know, it didn't work. And so, yeah, so that was interesting. And then like also like the breaking up of the meetings, right? That like meetings can be fun, and they don't have to be like 14-hour long, like arduous, very logical discussions. You know, like they can be entertaining. They can have music, or you know, people doing theatrical pieces, or you know, whatever. So that was good to you know, be reminded of. And yeah, and someone in the chat was just mentioning how creative Occupy was. Yeah, that was definitely true. Like the process was never sort of set in stone, right? Like we would have breaks all the time. Like people would come and yeah, play music, or they had an announcement about something. I mean, it was like really a very fluid space, which is sometimes very frustrating, but also just like beautiful. So you had to sort of drop into the spirit of the thing, like you were just there, and whatever sort of washed over you in that space, you know, was what happened. It could be a talent show on one side of the park, and then like a really serious conversation about patriarchy and fighting sexual assault on the other side, and then meanwhile someone could like, you know, be fighting with a cop in the front, or you know, like all of that could be contained like simultaneously in the space. And that's what made it like just so energetic. And so I mean, it was really like a community space, you know, people felt like they could add to it. Yeah, and embrace that like sort of diversity of tactics in a real way. You know, often so David talks a lot about the global justice movement and like compares the global justice movement to Occupy. And there is this debate in the global justice movement after the WTO about the Black Bloc, and you know, violence versus nonviolence, and some of that carried over into Occupy in the spring of 2012. And you know, really like diversity of tactics, you know, it isn't just a question of violence and nonviolence. I mean, that's you know, kind of, that's an absurd thing to reduce it to. It's really about that. It's about holding space for like all the various, you know, forms of expression and ways that people can relate to each other. You know, like that's what that would mean. And that's what we did. So, yeah. Nika?
Yeah, I also want to ask you to comment on, so we took an interview of Gabi Cabana, the David student, and she's now in Chile during this uprising, and she was describing how it's very quickly happened that on a local level, she's living now in some island, people are taking decisions only by consensus, because you know, it's a precious decision for them. Somebody would build something like some mine in the territory, and then they will be all poisoned, you know, something like this. So they have to agree, and they have to collect the energy to fight it, or to welcome some other people to protect them, or something like that. But the constitution that is now will be discussed for a year by parliament, of course, there's no consensus available, so it's a big grand scale, and basically now she supported it in the beginning, and now she felt like they all were tricked, and it was wrong to support it, because the constitution, of course, will legitimize the government that they try to overthrow. So what she described, that it was this kind of, you know, two different type of decision making and two different structures or levels of society, and it's now like everybody in Chile kind of left, you know, disappointed after this quite violent uprising and so many people losing their lives and being injured. It looks like it's come back to the square one. Yeah, so 10 years after Occupy, it will be great actually to come up with some kind of structure that will be that will be possible to be effective not only in a small group with like a precious decision, because we have to make like a global decision precious right now. That's what all Extinction Rebellion is about.
Yeah. The question of what to do now, 10 years later, is definitely a big one. I don't know if I can answer that like right away. I also just want to say, because like people are writing like questions in the chat, and I really hope that like you can just respond to each other. Like maybe put the raised hand signal up, or like your finger up or something. Or if there's like a long pause, you can just jump in, because I certainly don't have all the answers. That like we have answers collectively. That's like what the consensus process is about, right? Is like drawing on all of these different experiences and feelings and thoughts, and like coming to some better solution through collective intelligence. Yeah.
Just to follow up about on what Nika has just said about a consensus, but at a more global level, because we also use the term consensus to talk about the fact that left and right is, they basically agree on everything, on the essential, basically on the social and economic aspects of our life. Has anybody came up with like a better term to coin this consensus, what we call consensus politics, or this decision-making process?
Spinoza would use the convenire, but it's a Latin word. I don't know. It's too theoretical, maybe.
And literally, how would you translate that?
Cum means with, together, and venire is to come, so coming together, and it refers to the union of forces, and well, we'll have a reading group on Spinoza, so I'll not talk of it too much tonight, but it's about finding, it's based on what's common to everybody, common conditions, common goals, but so it was just a suggestion for a term.
It's also, yeah. Sorry. It's also interesting, in the 1960s and 70s, there was a philosophical debate about consensus versus dissensus, right? In which people like Habermas, that are often considered sort of like conservative people, said, no, we have to reach consensus. And I think it meant something different than in the Graeber essay, maybe, but it's very interesting. I just realized it's the same term. And yet people like Lyotard, the more radical people, and Rancière that say, no, radical politics is about dissensus. And like, I'm just making this connection. I don't know what to do with it.
But there's also terms like, if you look at democracy, like I know specifically in the United States, the term democracy, I think David talks about it in this book, but it might be elsewhere. Initially, the founding fathers thought it was like equal to chaos. And then Andrew Jackson, who was famous for genocide against Native Americans, started using it, and it kind of got co-opted to not mean like direct democracy, like we would say, but a representative republic like the United States government is. And so I guess there's a debate about like, should we even use the term democracy or not? Even though it's been misused, the common term is generally misused for than actually what the real mean is. So you can say the same thing with consensus of like, we might have a good understanding of consensus, but the fact that other people misuse it, or whether it's worthwhile to have a consensus with, people we don't disagree with, is another, like, neoliberals or whatever. That's kind of more questions.
Definitely. I guess, questions of strategy.
Yeah, exactly. I like the term democracy personally, at least as someone from the United States, because they're already, if you're talking to another person, they're already on board with, yes, democracy. And we're like, well, let's really talk about democracy and what that is. And you can kind of get them, move them. Whereas if you were to say like anarchy, they'd be like, no, anarchy is bad. But if you talk about democracy, they're like, yes, democracy. So it's just like a strategic question.
That's so true.
Yeah, democracy will have soon the same bad reputation as communism after Soviet Union because it was so much misused by the US.
Yeah, true.
But sorry, I'll be very slow because I'm thinking while I speak. Actually, consensus, to me at least, is about you can vote with your feet. If you don't agree, you just get out of the thing, and so it's something you must have when everybody is free to be inside the group to act together with the others, and it's essential. But to act collectively at a global level, you need a collective power that goes through institutions. I don't know how to get to collect a power grip enough to contest Google or Amazon without institutions and laws to back it. So our enemy is takes good care of taking hold of governments and institutions because it counts, because it is there that it is decided whether you will finance banks or basic income. How do you get a democratic power able to tackle with banks and with Amazon? For instance, in Italy, I don't know if abroad this is the term. In Italy, we call them the riders, those who take food or commodities by bike to people, and that are organized through Glovo or Eat It. I don't know the term in English, but
couriers.
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 Thank you. So couriers had organized in a trade union, unionized, and they had a legal victory against Glovo that imposed to this company to allow them some fundamental rights as workers. How can you enforce these rights without a government is my fundamental question. And to me, democracy is about being able to enforce coercion on banks, on multinational companies, and so on. And my question is how to. at a global level.
That's a political position. I think you kind of believe that without violence, you wouldn't be able to stop people who want to do harm. I think so. If I understand correctly, you kind of think that you have to have a strong. No?
This has nothing to do with violence, unless you think of Gewalt, but it's another issue. No, it has to do with institutions, with the constituted power as opposed to the constituent power. How my question, and it is a real question, not a rhetorical one, is how can you get enough force to tackle with big companies that pollute your water, or that just buy and sell you your water, without great institutions? And how do you, as people, control those institutions? So it's true that democracy is not a good name in this moment, but because it failed to take control of this, because we have lost control of these institutions, if ever we had part of it.
Yeah, I mean, there are a few. So I guess there's a question for me about the role, like the relationship of the institution to, well, to organized violence of some form, because the institution doesn't have, you know, like so in the United States in the last few weeks, there's been this like huge push to really emphasize, you know, democracy, and that democracy is stable, and, you know, like we need to fortify the Capitol because of all the craziness that, you know, that happened on the 6th. And you know, it's just very strange that like there's this sort of belief in the institution, like belief in the, you know, in the Capitol, or belief without, like, as somehow separate from the monopoly on violence, because like obviously it requires like thousands and thousands of, you know, National Guard troops to actually, like, you know, fortify the institution. So if we're thinking about like our own processes, or, you know, organizations, or maybe institutions, you know, then it's like, well, how do you defend them? How do you protect them? So I think it is still a question about violence, which Nika was pointing to.
Yes, then I'll be quiet. Sorry for this.
But that's a good question. I think Rozheva is, or Sabatistas is the one who long time now show how is it possible, because, you know, they do practice violence in a way, yeah, and they practice the violence that practices against them is huge. It's not only like Amazon, they, you know, they just attacked by like fascistic Turkey, or like paramilitaries all the time. But inside of the autonomy, they don't have government or parliament. So it's a different kind of, to my understanding, it's a separate question. So one question is how you organize inside of your day-to-day existence, and another question, how you deal with the violence that imposes on you. So that would be my, not answer, but train of thought, that way I would try to move with my thinking. So basically they don't know about, they don't need to destroy Amazon, because Amazon is not there. You know, just is not going to sell anything to them. And they just created, literally created an alternative institution institutions to Amazon, but when the water is like if somebody tried to take away the land and the water, then they just fight in different ways as much as they can. So yeah, I think the answer is what would be like they have a different vocabulary. They develop a different vocabulary. They not mirroring the institution. They're not saying, okay, Amazon is bad, let's do a good Amazon. they're saying, okay, so this is our language, our land, our way of living, and this is their institution. Let's keep them away from that. Something like this.
Mm-hmm.
When I was thinking about Simona's question, I often think of the word organizing, which is basically one way to think of it is building a team. When you do, say, for example, workplace organizing, you quickly realize that the workplace is highly organized. So if you're in a corporation, it's extremely well organized. So for example, if you go to a bookstore, if those things still exist, there's a section called management literature, full of books. When you try to find similar for the left, so counter-organizing, you find very few books, and many of which are of poor quality. So the ones that I found useful in organizing, directly useful, I could probably name about 3 or 4, as opposed to the very many good management books that I've read and have been able to find useful in even organizing, activist organizing. So I think, Simona, you did mention the answer in your question, which is yes. How do we do this without institutions? And of course, we want to build institutions, which are themselves organizations. That means we should level up in this whole practice of organizing, just as the dominant force, which is the elites, they have great organizing. They beat us wonderfully because they've got the institutional literature, they've got the practice, they've got experiments, and they treat many of themselves quite nicely in a place where you can learn. When you look at how managers learn, many of them are actually in quite nice places that treat them well, even if they don't treat their subordinates well. So yeah, that seems to be the answer. I think that we should look to the practice of organizing as well as many other things. Like obviously one who can just only organize but not do the actual work is kind of like a manager. So there's a number of tactics we can use. When we talk about consensus, I think that's one block. That was the literature that David wrote on consensus was to remove a mental block that the left had on, a bias, in favor of other forms of decision making. But I think we can move past that because I think more and more people do understand the use of consensus. And so our problems now lie elsewhere. That's just my view.
Other thoughts? I see Matt is highlighted. I'm not sure if that was from typing or.
That was from typing. Off mute.
I just remembered in the interview with Gabi from Chile, what thing that she said was that in the initial protests, what happened was that a lot of local groups actually came together. So there were a lot of things already happening. It's not like out of nothing, things got organized. So they already had their own processes that they came up with and how people learned a lot by doing on the streets. And she was saying that Nika is right, that in a way now, because the result of those protests was that they will rewrite the constitution and they will have these delegates group. In the meantime, these small groups are still fighting for each of their causes locally. But she said it was important for us to actually insert in the constitution things like universal basic income, to try to push for that and to make sure that in the meantime, they don't throw a bomb and kill us all. So they had to find some kind of middle way, which is disappointing, but I don't know, maybe long-term was a solution for them. So I don't know, that's kind of, I was thinking when Simona asked, how do we do both, working on an institution level, but also on the ground?
Well, I mean, there are some questions raised, even by David, about how to navigate these kinds of relationships, right? There's the police liaison description, which is interesting. Like we decided not to have police liaisons, for instance, because that would provide a way for the police to negotiate, and we didn't want that to be the case, or for them to be able to sort of influence those people or influence the direction of our actions. And so you could make a similar case for like anyone who's who's an appointed negotiator, if they're negotiating with city council or negotiating some other formal capacity. How do you ensure that that person, whoever that person is, doesn't just sell out the movement or do something that's against the principles or values that people share? Is it possible? Could you configure something in the role itself, or is it based on the individual? Do they have to just like be, I don't know, a trustworthy person? What do people think?
But sorry, just to make sure I got it right. So that was decided inside the Occupy, that there will be no police liaison. Was that the consensus?
Yeah, it's something that we decided before the occupation even began, like in the early assembly.
Miss Nika.
What? Oh, I don't know. Yeah, it was a very heated debate, but eventually, that's what we arrived at.
So I had a question kind of thinking about for everyone, really. So I appreciate and agree with that idea of like you organize a group to do something, and when it's done, you're done with it. So you don't kind of build this bureaucracy. But my interpretation of like the Arab Spring in Egypt, as well as it kind of sounds like in Chile, is you had these grassroots groups organizing to push for this new constitution. But then already well-organized, elites step in because they're well-organized and kind of are able to co-opt that, whether in Egypt, that's like the Muslim Brotherhood or whoever the elites are in Chile. They're already there, they're ready. And when the opportunity arises, they're like, okay, cool, let's co-opt this. So the question is, how can we have a well-organized version of ourselves that's ready to jump on those opportunities when they come without becoming our own horrible bureaucratic party?
Like DM.
Nika?
Yeah, I would just suggest we use the we rename the words. We have to win the public opinion, because if we try to build the same institutions, either it's army or it's different Amazon, the previous one, as you correctly said, Matt, they will be much more powerful because they were there before us. What happens in Zapatistas, Rojavas, Zat, or many other places, these people already have their culture. They didn't build it on the fly. They already had an agreement. They were talking about something that's precious for them and exists right now. And if they use violence, they only use it to protect whatever was there before. And I think Occupy was so successful in rearranging the discourse and basically reintroducing different words with different meanings. So after Occupy, everything changed.
Yeah.
They didn't occupy banks tent, and this Zuccotti Park is really small place. It's actually not so spectacular. When I was there, it looks like no, it's really not. It doesn't. And then when it becomes so big, it's like, oh my God, how does it even happen? But the real power was the power of imagination in a way, you know, because after that, if you look at the poll that Marisa correctly said is a public consensus about capitalism is bad for certain age group become, you know, like, I don't know, 80%. So that's a revolution in a way, you know. And then with that type of consensus, you can build a lot. So you don't actually need conquer the banks, you can just abandon them. So that's what I think we should do. And that's why I think like what we're trying to do in Museum of K and many other places, it's not to build an institution, but build you know, content and spread it out. You know, build something that will just people with the other people will take. And if, for example, Occupy will occupy Zuccotti Park and build there, you know, some kind of building, 20-story, and then put the people there, you know, and fundraise and, you know, go to job and whatever else, that would be just a failure. And instead of that, they were evicted. So, and that's actually turned out to be a victory.
Yeah, I agree. With Nika, there were a lot of people who tried to, you know, raise money and have like occupied offices. Right around the time of the eviction, there was this kind of bubbling network of spaces in the financial district, and you know, they connected to the unions, mostly like DC37 and PSC and whatever. They all had sort of offices. And some of them were paid for, like, you know, like Move On people had their office, and it became a real problem because people would just leave. There was an incentive to leave the park. So like all the people who were well connected politically or whatever, who had certain privilege, like they could, you know, have a meeting in their office space and then like not even engage with the, like, you know, rabble of the drummers or whoever was in the park, you know, and it became a real like race and class kind of divide too. I mean, it was bad. And so I think if that had been allowed to continue, it would have just eroded everything. And so in a way, it was better to just be evicted. Yeah.
Should we just wrap up now? Just somebody, I don't know how.
Someone has their hand up. Steve Batchelor.
Hi. So, you know, one of the words that, are you able to hear me? Sometimes this doesn't work.
Yep.
Okay. If right now the moment we're in is a conjunctural moment, and I believe that it is. I mean, we're in a conjunctural moment. One of the things that, because David's work took such a longue durée, he's able to identify those conjunctural moments. And so one of the words that he uses a lot is jubilee. And if you think about that from a tactical place, who doesn't like a jubilee? And it, you know, it offers something that I think people can quickly associate with good feelings and relief, I guess. So on that score, I had a question for you, Marisa, about the work now that you're doing. I'm curious to hear about it.
So it seems like a lot of people love jubilees also, which is great. It would, I mean, it would be great to have like a debt jubilee of some sort and celebrate. The work I'm doing now, so for the last like 4 or 5 years, I've been part of MAC. I helped start it, the Metropolitan Anarchist Coordinating Council, which is a long name, but it's basically like an assembly and working group structure, very similar to Occupy. We have a direct action group, we have a media group, that kind of thing. And we formed like in the lead up to Trump's inauguration and mobilized like an anti-fascist resistance for a couple of years up and down the East Coast. I mean, we were certainly not the only ones. A lot of different groups and people were involved in that kind of work. But yeah, that was the main reason that we came together. It was out of a desire among different anarchist groups in the city to, to have something that was a little tighter, a little more organized in the face of this threat. So yeah, I mean, I've been doing that. And then like since the pandemic, there's been a lot of focus on mutual aid. So like I'm part of this mutual aid group in MAC. And we have actually there's like a library of things, kind of tool lending platform that's being developed. There's like a mental health, emotional health support group because that's been, really a pressing need since the pandemic. There's a lot of housing organizing that's going on, which I'm actually not involved in at the moment, but that is, yeah, like bubbling up and becoming more militant. Yeah, and then of course, like Black Lives Matter has been happening, I mean, forever. But since 2014, there have been many waves, and there's another wave last summer, and Abolition Park, and various actions. So it was anyway. So like that is still going on too, and like for MAC, like we'll mobilize and attend like Black Lives Matter demos. Yeah, so that's the kind of work I guess like anti-fascist and anti-racist work and mutual aid. Those are the main things that I've been doing. But I have to say, the kind of positive, radical, imaginative space, that was created in Occupy and that like David really represented in a lot of ways for me, and I think for other people, has been hard to maintain. And yeah, so recently I've been like going through all this old Occupy footage and trying to think about and write about, that experience more and channel some of that energy, that like, positive energy. And yeah, we've been, because of the Museum of Care and everything that was talked about in the fall, we've actually been talking about in MAC having like a care assembly of some sort, where we would have like a discussion space around, care in various forms, like physical, mental, emotional, whatever, and kind of decolonizing also like our relationship to care and like asking each other how we can care for each other and that kind of thing, and offering like like acupuncture and different holistic medicine, like having people in the community offer these kinds of things. So that's something that's in the works right now, is like, dealing with the kind of health crisis, and among other crises, and then having this kind of prefigurative component. Yeah, but the rates are so high right now that probably it wouldn't happen in person until like the summer. So right now it's really in the research stages, but yeah, I think there's a lot that was learned in Occupy that can be applied to the current context, because it's like another crisis moment for sure on a whole other scale. Yeah.
Thank you, Marisa. I think we're going to wrap up soon because it's almost half past. I was wondering, where can we find the film you made on Occupy Wall Street?
Oh, it's online. It's on Vimeo. I had it just up for a long time, like publicly viewable, and then I put a password on it at some point. So I can send it with the password, or I can take the password off. I don't know. But it was supposed to be just, available for public use for Creative Commons. So I'm happy to share it. I guess I'll just email you and Nika, and then go from there.
Put it on the mailing list. Thank you so much. Yeah, cool.
So if we have any announcements to make, Just one. There is the LSE, the Department of Sociology, is organizing a reading group on the 5th of February about this same book, the Democracy Project. So I suppose we can all register if we want to talk about this more. And I assume that we're going to finish this chapter with Marisa, maybe if you can attend again. But the date is to be announced. I'll share the link for the registration for the LSE thing. Here we go.
Cool.
Any questions?
Thank you so much for coming. That was so great.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks everyone, and
thank you.
I guess I'll see you at this next event. I think I already signed up. So.
Oh, cool.
All right.
Thank you very much, Marisa. Thank you.